Hey everyone, let's talk crypto regulation. Now, regulators right now see us in crypto winter and they're doing what they can to kick the industry while we are down. Now, some might see regulation and a discussion on its impact as FUD, but it is very real and it is very material. In the long run, I do think the crypto world needs some regulation. It could have helped avoid issues we saw last year with FTX, Terra Luna, and the fallout from each of those. Some projects throw caution in the wind, seemingly in the hopes for quicker profits. And on the other hand, some projects like Ecomi have done a great job trying to be as compliant as possible. The problem is that regulators will target whoever they want, as we saw with Paxos, who like Ecomi is partnered with multiple big brands and has a long history of trying to be compliant. They've been ordered by the SEC to stop issuing BUSD, which is Binance's stablecoin, so nobody is immune to this. This is magnified with a recent development that isn't being talked about enough. While most of the mainstream media coverage on regulation centers around whether crypto is a security or not, and don't get me wrong, that is a serious part which Ecomi is not immune to, and more on that later, but the goalpost has been moved again to crypto custody. Let me quickly outline the current regulatory system on custody. The SEC regulates registered investment advisors who have strict rules about the custody of their clients' assets and can only be held by qualified custodians. As part of the Dodd-Frank Act of 2010, the US Congress granted the SEC not only powers over securities, but every single type of asset. So that also includes crypto. Recently, the SEC, using that power, proposed a new rule intended to help ensure qualified custodians provide certain standard of custodial protections when maintaining a client's assets. These protections are designed, amongst other things, to ensure client assets are properly segregated and held in accounts to protect the assets in the event of a qualified custodian bankruptcy or other insolvency. Now, this recent change specifically is going after crypto. He explicitly calls out crypto when explaining this new rule. Now, I think this is generally a good thing that would have prevented a lot of the issues of lost funds last year. But the biggest issue, in my opinion, is how regulation is happening. The SEC is not giving anyone specific and updated guidance for this new industry, but rather just saying, hey, you're non-compliant and handing out fines to everybody. They fined BlockFi for $100 million, and they're paying that. Nexo got fined $45 million, and they settled for about half. Kraken got fined $30 million, and they stopped their staking service. And even celebrities got hit, with Paul Pierce getting fined $1.4 million and Kim Kardashian getting fined $250K. Nobody is safe. So what does this all have to do with Ecomi? Well, this actually has to do with a lot of crypto projects out there, but within Veve and the Ecomi community, the talk about regulation so far only has covered the securities argument. And even then, they're missing some key parts that I'll cover later in this video. But nobody has talked about crypto custody. As part of the Omi Utility Program, or OUP, you need to deposit Omi tokens in the app. I have Omi tokens in the app right now. I don't have the keys, nobody does, because Ecomi is the custodian of our tokens that are staked as a part of OUP. An argument can even be made that since we can't take our NFTs off the app yet, Ecomi is a custodian of our NFTs as well, making this an even bigger issue. Now, I know that's a licensing decision, but if our NFTs are assets, and they're in a walled garden, then whoever owns that garden are custodians of those assets. Now, do you see where the potential issue is? Ecomi is not a qualified custodian, and I do think it's only Coinbase who is has the most legitimate argument to say that they are. Maybe Ecomi can be one day down the road, but they currently are not. It's a legitimate risk that nobody's talking about. Maybe it's a good thing we haven't blown up as big as everyone wanted to last year. Otherwise, we'd have a bigger target on our backs. Let's move on to potential regulation that I see as very likely. Now, this was a thought when I first heard that John Ray III was taking over as CEO during the FTX bankruptcy. Now, this is near and dear to me because John Ray III also played a similar role during the Enron bankruptcy. Now, the collapse of Enron and their accounting firm Arthur Andersen led to the creation of SOX, or Sarbanes-Oxley, or the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, rather. Now, this is important to me because as a junior accountant in the mid-2000s, it was all the rage. Every job posting said that you must have Sarbanes-Oxley experience. Everything was all about SOX compliance. It was a very big deal, and for good reason. Enron shareholders lost $74 billion. Arthur Andersen, the accounting firm who failed their due diligence and actually supported the fraud on Enron's books, they collapsed. The big five accounting firms just became the big four. When all is said and done with FTX and there is a post-mortem with regulators, I believe, and this is just my opinion here, that there will be a crypto version of SOX. SOX is a tried, tested, and true set of regulations that would have prevented what happened with FTX. And the similarities between the two situations is pretty striking. Related party transactions, and with FTX, it was between FTX and Alameda, and probably more that we don't know about just yet. With Enron, it was between its subsidiaries. Both kept transactions off the books to hide their losses, and both had complete and utter failures of basic internal controls. Integrating a crypto version of SOX with crypto companies isn't that difficult if you have the ability to take on more costs. Many small platforms who are just selling promises probably can't do much, but companies like Ecomi probably can. I show gems entering the app and weekly revenue on the weekly drops in my stat pack I provide for the Cherry Charts newsletter. They need that cash for extra admin staff, external auditing fees, internal audit staff, and developing and maintaining their internal controls. This is still an evolving situation with FTX, as investigations are still ongoing, and I believe there's definitely more regulation to come. In my opinion, that will come with a version of SOX, but for crypto companies. Before we get into how OMI might violate the Howey Test, we need to quickly talk about stablecoins if we're going to talk about regulation. Now, this isn't an Ecomi specific thing, this is a wider crypto thing. In the short term, it might cause issues, but I think in the long term, for the long-term growth of our industry, it is needed. In the short term, because many cryptos are tied to a stablecoin, like a USDT pairing. And you could imagine what will happen if there are rumors the Fed is going to shut down a stablecoin, because people will remember the collapse of Terra USD and its impact. In the long term, I think it's needed. I've long believed that the mass adoption needs a safe and secure backbone, and stablecoins are that backbone. Once that is regulated and secure, the big money will feel incrementally more comfortable getting back into this. Regardless, this is regulation that will have a widespread effect. And if FTX didn't happen, I thought that actually regulation of stablecoins would have been the first thing to be regulated. Now, let's talk about the Howey Test. Yes, Ecomi changed things since their original white paper to try to reduce the risk of being classified as a security. There are a few angles, however, where it really can be viewed as one. There are 4 requirements to the Howey Test: an investment of money in a common enterprise with the expectation of profit derived from the efforts of others. Now, the first 2 are pretty easy to satisfy for most projects out there. For number 3, Ecomi made their staking program in a way that it rewarded stakers with items without an initial real-world value to minimize that risk, which is really good. They also have removed the burn and buyback system to minimize the impact of the hands-on action of reducing supply. So in a way, removing the efforts of others, efforts of the Ecomi team to create a profit through reducing supply. Now, I did an overview of the OUP when it came out months ago. I left out this issue because I wanted to focus on the mechanics of it. I put a pin in this idea and this thought for a future video focusing on regulation, and here it is. The issues are they have burned tokens in the past. The last token burn I remember was in 2021 when they were supposed to have this virtual event during the pandemic Comic-Con, but Future Tech Live, who they were partnered to launch this event, I think they kind of screwed up the virtual platform. So I felt like burning those tokens after that kind of failure felt like to me they were trying to get the mood back up after a lot of people were pretty disappointed. But Ecomi has by far exceeded the expectations with regards to Comic-Cons and being a big part of it in partnership with Marvel. But I just distinctively remember what happened there back in 2021. The first problem is with regards to the Howey Test, supporters would say, well, we used to actively burn tokens, but we don't anymore. Well, if I go out on the street and I shoot somebody, can I tell the cops that, hey, that was me yesterday. I'm kind of a new guy today. I'm a much more compliant citizen, so don't arrest me. It doesn't work like that. But if there are degrees of guilt, yes, Ecomi has done the right thing, and stopping the manual burns will probably help them if they were fined. They'll probably have a better chance than anyone else to reduce the fine. While that helps, they're not immune to it. And I still think it's a clear risk in my opinion. We do have to give them credit though. If there are levels of guilt, there are levels to this, they're in a better position because of the change. That's just the first potential issue for the Howey Test to me. The second comes from the OUP itself versus that fourth point on the efforts of others. Yes, Putin, Reese, and the team have done a great job creating this latest version of the OUP. It's creative, but it's complex. The OEP had a laundry list of things it needed to do, and the team successfully checked all those boxes. But it is very complex because of that. Is that complexity, even though the burns in the system are now automated, is that complexity and that system created on the efforts of others? Let me give you an example. Here's a jar of chocolate covered espresso beans from Soma, it's a chocolate store down the street. If these represented a cryptocurrency that I created called crypto beans, a natural and reasonable use of my cryptocurrency is to use it as part of buying and selling. So let's say for NFTs. If I trade a bean to you, you give me an NFT. That sounds reasonable. Even if there was a utility token that'd be used like any other game specific currency like V-Bucks or FIFA points, to be used only within the closed ecosystem of that game as part of buying and selling. But because of the over complex nature of the OUP, to fulfill that big checklist, it's like saying, okay, if I put some beans in a jar and you get some points out of that. And if beans go into another jar, then they go into the grinder, never to join the jar again. But you can also trade beans for tickets, and that moves beans to another jar. I can also exchange these beans for cookies, and when I do, some beans go to other jars. And there are different levels of jars that when you fill enough jars, you get master bean collector status, and you get a plate to put your beans on, right? The creation of those jars, those plates, and those wallets, that whole system was created on the efforts of others. What I'm getting at is it's not natural. This is not like anything out there. And I do like the fact that they're pioneering possibly a new novel way to get around the rules. And I do think if they are targeted by the SEC, this novel system will reduce any fines that they will potentially face because it's not a constant violation of the rules. It's just at the initial point. The projects who are burning tokens constantly to get people to FOMO into their projects, those are the ones who will get hit the hardest. I do think if they are targeted by regulators, like many things, guilt or level of guilt will come down to who has the best lawyers. So have I made this video to scare you from buying Omi or Veve NFTs? No. On the contrary, if you hear what I have to say next, you might actually do the opposite. One of my old bosses used to ask me, whenever there was any change, any policy change or any reporting change requirement, he'd ask me, hey, Brad, what are the risks and opportunities of this? And I'd do kind of a improv SWOT analysis for him, give him the implications, issues, and my recommendations. There are two parts to this conversation. The good, aka the opportunities, and the bad, aka the risks. If anyone is selling you only the good, saying this project is the best thing since sliced bread, then I don't want the magic beans that you're selling me. This is a lesson on critical thinking as much as it is on regulation. Because if you use the same critical lens for other projects, then you'll see that most are actually guilty. The key here is if there are levels to that guilt, then Ecomi and projects like Ecomi have set themselves up to at least get cushioned if our industry gets hit hard with regulations this winter. That's the risk and reward you need to be assessing different projects on, not just hearing the reward from influencers. Because if they're missing the risk portion, they're also missing the most basic concept of investing, risk versus reward. Ecomi is not immune to regulation. They definitely have risk exposure to it, as I explained earlier in the video, but they have pioneered some pretty novel methods to mitigate that risk. That's the reality of the situation as I see it. Now, it's important to understand that as regulation is evolving, because it is kind of needed, and the regulators are probably going to hit us hard with it this crypto winter. Thanks for watching.